Back when I was younger, I had this habit of wandering the streets of my hometown late at night. It wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd brag about, just a struggling little town tucked away in the mountains, surrounded by forests as far as the eye could see. Around that time, people in town started whispering about strange creatures being spotted. But to me, it all sounded like the same kind of made-up nonsense you hear about the boogeyman or Bigfoot. Then came one December night that changed everything. The wind was howling like it had a mind of its own, and a blizzard had rolled in thick, blanketing the whole area in fog. I can't even tell you what was going through my head, but for some reason, I decided to take a stroll into the woods, completely alone, right in the dead of night. Before long, I realized I'd made a big mistake. I'd lost my sense of direction and couldn't figure out how to get back. The deeper I wandered, the more I felt like the trees were closing in on me. And then, I started hearing something. This faint, eerie screeching sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. At first, I thought I was just imagining things. But no matter where I went, the sound followed, growing louder with each step I took. Just when I thought I might lose my mind, I spotted an old hunter's post built into a tree. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but the ladder seemed sturdy enough, so I climbed up. Inside, the place was simple. A small wooden floor for walls and a rickety roof overhead. Lying in the middle of the floor was an old map, and in one corner was a box filled with what looked like junk. It wasn't much, but it was better than freezing out there in the storm. I figured I'd try to ride out the night in this makeshift shelter. At least it was quieter up there, and I had a roof over my head. But sleeping, that wasn't happening. The screeching sounds still echoed in my ears, and they were impossible to ignore. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, a new noise joined in. A scratching sound coming from the base of the ladder. Curious and terrified all at once, I peeked through a crack in the floorboards. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. Standing there, clawing at the ladder, was a creature straight out of a nightmare. Its body was mostly pale white, with random black splotches covering its skin. The way it moved was unnatural, and when its eyes locked onto mine, it felt like it could see straight into my soul. I froze. My legs refused to work, partly from the cold and partly from the sheer terror of the thing staring up at me. Then, before I could stop myself, I lost my balance and fell to the floor of the post. My head barely missed the box of junk in the corner. Panicked and desperate, I scrambled toward the box and started digging through it, hoping to find something, anything, that could help me. At the very bottom of the box, my shaking hands found something useful, a flare. My heart raced as I fumbled with the lighter I'd stashed in my pocket, finally managing to ignite the flare. Its red glow filled the small hunter's post, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Without thinking, I thrust the burning flare downward through the opening in the floor and swung it toward the creature below. But to my horror, the creature didn't flinch. It didn't back away, didn't even seem to notice the flames. It just kept clawing at the ladder with this eerie, single-minded focus. That's when I saw them. Two more creatures standing just beyond the first. Their pale, blotchy skin seemed to reflect the red light of the flare, making them look even more otherworldly. My fingers went numb. Whether from fear or exhaustion, I couldn't tell. The flare slipped from my grasp and fell to the ground below. As soon as it landed, an ear-piercing, blood-curdling scream filled the air. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, like metal grinding against metal, layered with the raw pain of something not meant to exist in this world. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the way the flames illuminated the thrashing figure of one of the creatures, its body writhing as the flare caught it. And then, nothing. When I came to, the creatures were gone. The post was silent, except for the soft creaking of the wind moving through the trees. Outside, the blizzard had finally passed, leaving the forest eerily calm under a clear night sky. My head throbbed, and my body felt like it had been through a battle I couldn't quite recall. But somehow, I managed to climb down the ladder and make my way back home. Took a while to recover. I could hardly sleep for days, haunted by the memory of those creatures. When I felt strong enough, I went to see two local hunters I'd known for years, guys who'd been in those woods more times than they could count. I told them my story, hoping they'd laugh it off and reassure me it was nothing but a bad dream. But their faces turned pale as I spoke. Both of them had their own stories, almost identical to mine. They described the same strange creatures, the same bone-chilling encounters, and even the same loss of consciousness that made the whole thing feel like a nightmare. And yet, it wasn't. Couldn't be. 2 years have passed since that night, but the memory still lingers. Like a shadow I can't shake. The hunters and I have made a pact. We're gonna figure out what those creatures were, no matter what it takes. Something about them felt wrong, like they didn't belong here, and I can't rest until I know the truth. Right now, I'm gearing up to head back into the woods. This time, I won't be alone. I've got a couple of buddies joining me, and they swear up and down they've experienced the same kind of weird, unexplainable things I have. Guess we're all tied together by this lingering curiosity, or maybe it's something darker, like a need to make sense of the things that haunt us. A quick life update for those wondering. I'm 18 now, and I finally got my driver's license. Having that freedom has made it easier for me to visit those woods whenever the pull gets too strong to ignore. Not that these trips have been safe, far from it. The place has only gotten worse since that night 2 years ago. Lately, there's been a string of missing person reports tied to those woods. There's no rhyme or reason to who vanishes. The victims are all different ages, genders, and backgrounds. The only common thread is where they disappear. And when some of them are eventually found, well, they're never alive. The bodies they recover are horrifying, stripped completely of flesh and teeth, like something out of a nightmare. It's gruesome enough to make your stomach churn just thinking about it. I don't know much about how they identify the victims, but I figure it's gotta involve DNA or something like that. Forensic stuff has always been a mystery to me. I've only ever seen it on shows like CSI or Bones. Either way, the authorities don't release much information, and the whole situation has left the town on edge. I've had some pretty harrowing moments out there myself. One of the worst happened about a year ago. I was one of the first people to stumble across a body. It was a little kid, no older than 5 or 6. I'll never forget the sight of it. Broken, lifeless, and so small. That moment changed me. It's like a switch flipped inside me, and ever since, I've been numb most of the time just going through the motions. Even now, I can't close my eyes without seeing that child's face. Maybe that's why I can't leave it alone. Maybe that's why I keep going back. It's not just curiosity anymore. It feels like a responsibility, a desperate need to put an end to whatever's causing this. This time, though, I'm not taking any chances. I'm not going out there alone. With the way my mind's been lately, I doubt I'd last a night by myself. My friends and I are pooling our courage and resources, preparing ourselves as best we can. We're bringing flashlights, weapons, and whatever else we think might give us an edge. I'll keep everyone updated on how it goes. Hopefully, I'll still have enough cell service out there to let folks know what's happening. And if things go south, well, I just hope someone else picks up where we left off. What I've seen out here is enough to haunt me for the rest of my days. Honestly, I think I've bitten off more than I can chew. This situation with the woods is bigger, darker, and more twisted than I ever could have imagined. In my last post, I told you all how I was planning to head back into the woods with my friends to get some answers. Well, we did exactly that. Let me introduce my crew. First, there's Mark. Mark's a big guy, 6 feet 1 inch and built like a linebacker. He's strong as an ox and just as stubborn, with a love for hunting that rivals my own. If there's anyone you want by your side in a tight spot, it's him. Then there's Leon. Leon's more laid back, the kind of guy who always keeps his cool no matter what's happening. He's another experienced hunter, but his real expertise is tracking. If something leaves so much as a faint trail, Leon will find it. He's also a walking arsenal, big into guns and knows them inside and out. When I told him about our plans, he didn't hesitate to gear us up with some serious firepower. Oh, and I guess I should probably introduce myself too. Can't believe I've gone this long without telling you my name. I'm Hutch. I'm 5 feet 10 inches, not as strong as Mark, but I'm no slouch either. I've got a bit of muscle and I know how to handle myself when things get rough. We spent a good while preparing before heading out. We packed all the essentials: food, water, extra clothes, first aid kits, and, thanks to Leon, some serious weapons. Each of us had an AR fully loaded, along with 3 extra magazines. With everything we brought, we figured we could survive out there for at least a week if we had to. By the time we got to the woods, it was around noon. The place was smothered in a thick fog that seemed to hang low between the trees, like a ghostly curtain. It wasn't long before the silence of the woods started to feel oppressive, pressing down on us as we moved deeper in. We began visiting the locations where we'd experienced strange things in the past, hoping for some kind of clue. But to our surprise, we found nothing out of the ordinary. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs that anything unusual had been there. After a while, we started to get discouraged. That's when Mark spoke up. "Maybe the things we're looking for are sleeping," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Didn't all of our stories happen at night?" Leon and I stopped to think about it, then nodded in agreement. "Yeah, makes sense," Leon said. Mark continued, "They're probably nocturnal." Then he turned to me. "Didn't you say the creatures ran off when you lit that flare? Maybe they're afraid of the light." Hearing him say it made me feel like an idiot. Of course, that explained why they'd reacted so violently to the flare. I nodded again, this time with a newfound sense of determination. We started brainstorming, trying to figure out where these creatures might hide during the day. That's when I remembered something I'd overheard in town. A couple of locals had been talking about a massive cave deep in the woods. They said it was eerie, almost otherworldly. One of them mentioned hearing screams coming from inside, and the other swore they'd heard what sounded like a crying infant echoing from the darkness. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but at the same time it felt like a lead, a solid place to start. "What if that's where they're hiding?" I asked. Mark and Leon exchanged a glance. "Then that's where we're going," Mark said firmly. And just like that, we had a new plan. Our next stop would be that cave, no matter how far we had to go or what we might find waiting for us there. When I first overheard folks in town talking about that cave, I didn't think much of it. Back then, rumors were flying left and right about all sorts of strange things happening in the woods. Half of them sounded like tall tales made up to spook kids or pass the time. It was hard to tell what was real and what wasn't, so I just brushed it off. But now, standing here with Mark and Leon, it felt different. Felt real. I told them what I remembered about the cave. The screams, the crying infant, the eerie atmosphere. And to my relief, they didn't laugh it off. Instead, they both agreed it was worth checking out. The woods had already tested our patience by this point. We'd been hiking for 7 long hours, and the constant fog and eerie silence weren't making it any easier. I could feel frustration building up inside me, but I tried to keep it in check. It took a couple more hours of trudging through the forest, but we eventually found it. The cave. We reached it just before the last light of the day started to fade, and the sight of it immediately set us on edge. The fog, which had already been thick, seemed to grow denser the closer we got. It was as if the cave itself was breathing it out, spilling it into the woods around us. As we approached the entrance, we heard it. At first, it was faint, so soft that I thought I might be imagining it, but the sound grew louder with every step we took. It was unmistakable, a baby crying. The sound echoed out of the cave, sharp and piercing, cutting through the stillness of the forest. The 3 of us froze in our tracks. None of us said a word, but I could see the nervous glances Mark and Leon exchanged. I was just as scared as they were. The crying had this strange, unnatural quality to it, like it didn't belong in this world. For a moment, none of us moved. We stood there, staring at the dark mouth of the cave, torn between the instinct to run and the reason we'd come here in the first place. Mark finally broke the silence. "We came out here to stop this," he said, gripping his flashlight tightly. "If there's someone or something in there, we can't just turn back." His voice was steady, but I could tell he was nervous too. I nodded, swallowing hard, and Leon gave a small grunt of agreement. Slowly, cautiously, we made our way closer to the cave. The crying grew louder with every step, until it felt like it was pounding in our ears. It wasn't just loud. It was gut-wrenching, the kind of sound that twisted your insides and made you feel helpless. When we reached the entrance, Mark was the first to act. He raised his flashlight and shined it into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the fog, illuminating the rocky ground inside the cave, and what we saw made my stomach drop. The floor was littered with teeth. Not just a few here and there, but dozens, maybe even hundreds, scattered across the cave floor. They gleamed in the flashlight's beam, stark and white against the dark stone. Some of them looked animal-like, but too many of them seemed human. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the tension in the air as Mark and Leon took it in too. None of us said a word, but the weight of what we'd just seen hit us like a freight train. This wasn't just a cave, it was a graveyard, a place where something terrible had happened, and maybe still was happening. Mark kept his flashlight moving, scanning the walls and floor of the cave, his hand trembling slightly as he tried to stay steady. Then, out of the corner of my eye, something huge and fast skittered across the beam of light. My heart stopped for a moment, and I heard Leon whisper under his breath, "What the hell was that?" Mark quickly swung the light toward the direction it had gone, his breathing heavy and uneven. What the beam landed on made my stomach drop and my legs turn to jelly. Standing before us was a 7-foot-tall creature, its massive body and 8 spindly legs giving it a spider-like appearance. But that wasn't the worst of it. Its legs and torso were grotesque, covered in bits of what looked like human skin, hanging in uneven patches as if they had been ripped off and stuck there. Some pieces flapped loosely as it moved, and the sight was so unnatural that I felt bile rise in my throat. But it wasn't until the light hit its face that true fear gripped me like never before. Its face wasn't that of a spider, it was the face of a human baby. At first glance, it looked like a newborn's innocent face, but the longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly across its head. The baby's lips curled back unnaturally wide, revealing rows upon rows of jagged, needle-like teeth that seemed to twist and jut out in every direction. And the crying, that horrible, gut-wrenching wail that had led us to the cave in the first place. Now it was deafening. The sound didn't stop, just grew louder and louder as its mouth opened wider. I couldn't take my eyes off the void of those terrible teeth. It felt like staring into a bottomless pit, one that could swallow me whole. I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, until Leon's voice shattered my trance. "Light it up!" he yelled, his voice sharp with panic. Then came the gunfire. Leon opened fire with the AR, the sound of the shots ricocheting off the walls of the cave. He aimed low, and I saw one of the creature's long legs buckle and snap as bullets tore through it. "Shoot its legs before it kills us!" Leon screamed. His voice was raw, desperate, and it snapped me into action. The creature, even with one leg gone, was frighteningly fast. It lunged at Mark, its jagged legs stabbing into his shoulder like a spear. Mark let out a pained yell, staggering backward. I didn't think, I just acted. I raised my gun and fired, aiming for its horrible, twisted face. The bullets hit their mark, and the creature paused, its movements slowing for a brief moment. But then it turned, locking those empty, baby-like eyes onto me. It opened its mouth wider, the crying now a deafening wail that made my head pound. I knew it was coming for me, and I lifted my gun again, ready to fire. But before I could pull the trigger, something whizzed past my head and straight into the creature's gaping mouth. There was a split second of silence as the thing clamped its teeth down on whatever had been thrown. Then I heard Leon's voice behind me, loud and urgent. "Run!" I turned to see Leon, his hand still raised as if he'd just thrown something. It didn't take long to figure out what it was. A grenade. Mark was already sprinting deeper into the cave, clutching his wounded shoulder, and Leon and I didn't waste a second following him. The explosion went off behind us, a thunderous boom that shook the cave walls and sent a wave of heat rushing past us. The crying stopped immediately, cut off mid-wail. But none of us slowed down. We ran until our lungs burned, until we were sure we weren't being followed. Finally, we collapsed onto the cave floor, gasping for air. For a long time, none of us said a word. The only sound was our ragged breathing as we tried to process what had just happened. Mark winced as he sat up, holding his shoulder where the creature had stabbed him. Leon crouched down beside him, inspecting the wound to make sure it wasn't too bad. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was nasty. We did what we could to patch him up with the first aid supplies we had brought. After what felt like an eternity, Leon broke the silence with a half-hearted chuckle. "Good thing I packed a grenade," he muttered, shaking his head. As reckless as it was, I couldn't help but agree. Without that grenade, we might not have made it out alive. We decided to set up camp for the night, though none of us felt particularly safe, even after what we'd just survived. We ate a little, but no one said much. The air was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and questions. As I lay there in the darkness, staring up at the rocky ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every so often, I thought I heard the faint sound of crawling, like the echo of something skittering just beyond the edges of our light. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over.